Now we are starting with the second session that is on Geo4SDGs and the circular economy. I would like to welcome Caroline Robinson, Senior Editor, Maplines Magazine, British Cartographic Society, the Netherlands.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Sorry I'm a bit squeaky. I've got a bit of a sniffle, but it isn't COVID, I promise. What a wonderful morning to come into and actually feel the weather as we're coming in. We've got an exciting Geo4SDGs and the circular economy panel coming up with presentations and introductions from Amy Cougar-Batineau, from CEO of CADASTA Foundation, Fair Data Makes Better Data, Cathrine Armour, Chief Customer Officer from UK Hydrographic Office, Forest Inventory by means of LiDAR data, and Sevcik, Manager, Strategic Software Alliances from RIEGL. So this is a bit of a passion of mine in terms of land management. Excuse me. How do we manage land better for the use of the whole of humanity and not for specific interests and profit? How do we then turn that into a circular economy so we're returning to the ground what we have extracted? And how do we minimize our impact on the earth? So I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentations that are coming up.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Amy Coughenour Betancourt. I am the CEO of CADASTA Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization working globally to advance land and resource rights. So Greg did me a favor and talked a little bit this morning about what a circular economy actually is. But I just want to say there are a lot of definitions out there, and just for simplicity purposes, the way I understand it is that a circular economy creates economic, social, and natural capital by doing these three things: designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and then regenerating natural systems. And it's this last one that I really want to talk about in the context of land rights. There's also the conversation about a circular bioeconomy, which is essentially replacing industrial sources for producing food, materials, and energy with biological resources. And I'm not really going to get into that. What I really want to focus on is what is the purpose of these economies, whether it's bioeconomy or a circular economy. Well, the purpose is economic prosperity, environmental quality, and human well-being. And I think in the human well-being part of it, it's about a sustainable well-being and inclusive well-being. So the problem that we deal with at CADASTA Foundation, and our reason for being, is that there are 1 billion tenure insecure people globally. And there's a statistic out there from the World Bank that says that 70% of land in emergency economies is unregistered, that the people who live on that land do not have any kind of formal legal claims or titles from the government to that land. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has specifically put out a report saying that this state of insecure land tenure affects the ability of people to make changes to land that advance adaptation and mitigation for climate change. So this is really a fundamental issue around regenerative or regenerating natural systems, is that if the people living on the land who are there as guardians and stewards of the land, who can effectively put in place adaptive and mitigating approaches, if they do not have legal rights to that land, then there's no real chance of having the kind of climate adaptation mitigation at scale that we need. And so really there's no circular economy or bioeconomy without the sustainable and equitable use of land and natural resources. And there's a real disconnect then between the idea of regenerative natural systems and the fact that land and resource rights are not secure for the majority of people and land in emerging economies. So really, we find ourselves in a global land crisis. We see growing evictions and displacement, deforestation, pollution, land grabs, Obviously, loss of habitat and biodiversity, but also livelihoods, history, and culture, particularly within indigenous lands and communities. And then, of course, gender inequality and unregistered rights. So if we want to talk about a circular economy and we want to talk about the natural systems aspect of it, we must talk about land and resource rights, and we must talk about how we're going to formalize that at scale. And of course, land tenure security underpins the success of most of the SDGs, and these elements of conservation, sustainable land use, et cetera. And what I just find amazing is that within the SDGs, if you break them down, there are 5 SDGs that really specifically relate to land tenure, but really there are 13 of the SDGs that relate some way or another to land. 59 targets and 65 indicators. And so we cannot achieve the SDGs locally or globally without addressing the issue of land tenure rights, and the issue of the relationship between people and land. CADASTA is the world's leading global land technology and services platform. It's a big statement, but we claim it, and we hope to continue along those lines. But we focus on empowering vulnerable communities to affordably and easily document, map, and secure inclusive land and resource rights. And our purpose is to have a more sustainable and equitable planet. So we work with a lot of different partners and donors to make this happen. This is just a small list. We work with a lot of the bilaterals, some of the multilaterals, some of the land mapping agencies that do international work, like Land Materiet in Sweden and Cadastre International here in the Netherlands. And we're also starting to do more and more work with conservation and climate organizations like Conservation International and others, who are really starting to understand that if they want to preserve biodiversity and forests and wildlife, they need to focus on the issue of land and resource rights for people. So by focusing on this area, CADASTA is empowering communities to improve forest and land conservation, to improve access, rights, and opportunities for women, youth, and indigenous communities, but also to spur sustainable food, energy, and resource systems, including as part of a circular economy, and also more transparently on governance. So we really, CADASTA brings technology, tools, and training to do this mapping and documentation to these different stakeholders. And we really focus on the idea of local empowerment, empowering local organizations, NGOs, communities, indigenous groups, et cetera, as well as local governments, to map and document both individual and community rights, and to use that information and use that data to not only advance tenure, but also to solve other problems in their communities. We work in cities, farms, and forests, and our cross-cutting areas are women's empowerment and equality, climate sustainability, and youth development. And I think what CADASTA uniquely brings together, which is a bit unusual, is this focus on land administration. We have land administration experts, technology and the appropriate use of technology in a local context, and then sort of sustainable community development expertise. We bring that all together in one agency, and we focus on supporting the groups who are working on the ground in this space. This is our dashboard globally. We are only, we're in the 6th year of operation. We were created in 2015, so we're a very young organization. But in that time, we have almost 5.5 million people mapped on our platform. We work with 85 partners globally in 38 countries. That includes about almost over 19.5 million hectares of land and 2,000 communities. And the data on our platform of those people, people whose rights are mapped, 53% of those are women, which is a big deal because of the issue of women's land rights and how critical that is and how difficult that is. And we offer a range of tools, technology, and services, and we are an Esri-based platform. And we find that while the technology is critical to it, it's only really a small piece. We have to provide technical assistance, training, and support to ultimately turn this over and enable these local partners to do what they do best. So I just wanted to give one example of this to kind of show you what it looks like on the ground. Again, we work with 85 different partners who have data on the platform. Very clearly want to state that the data is not owned by CADASTA. It is owned by our partners in the local community, so that's important to say. But this example is in India, in 2 states, Odisha and Jharkhand, and it has to do with the Indian Forest Rights Act, which was passed by the government in 2006, but under which very little land has actually been formalized and very few rights have been issued. And so what we did is we focused on bringing technology to a local organization called Pradhan. And actually we have 25 partners in India that we work with, but this is just one of the examples. So far they've mapped over 300,000 hectares and have captured the rights of 8,700 individuals, but that continues to grow as they expand out their work. So this is just an example of some of the base layers. What's important here, it captures village boundaries, cadastral maps as base maps, revenue maps, and then village boundaries. So I said that already. But the important thing is that it needs to follow a bureaucratic government process of verification from the very local governance body, the panchayat, all the way through the revenue office, the forest office. So this is just one of the maps. And then the survey tool is a data collection tool that's used locally. The Pradhan engages community mappers. In fact, this is a photo of them mapping, and we make sure to engage women and youth in this process. But it's about both individual and community forest rights. There are 2 different processes for that. This shows different stages of mapping. It lists the district, the village, which is the panchayat, which is the government body, as well as the information on the claimant, and then, of course, the geospatial information. Pradhan has used this data to put out these individual forest rights maps for the first time. They've never had this kind of data collection or this kind of mapping and outputs done before, as well as community forest resources. And then this is their dashboard. And you can see on here gender ownership, total parcels, total individuals, total hectares, land use types, what type is it, cultivation, homestead, et cetera, percentage of revenue to non-revenue forest, and then other types of information. This is just one of the screens. But this was Pradhan's, they actually created this slide because they were doing a presentation to share out how it's worked for them. And this is what they said, that it's easy to understand by community users, and I'm talking about community mappers. There's both on and offline data collection, which is important. The communities are very excited to see the maps printed out and to verify their land on site. That engages them in a new way. And it also supports the M&E and reporting out through dashboards and is easy and transparent and cost-effective to replicate. And then finally, just a bit about the impact. A lot of what I shared with you is output data. But we did a third-party evaluation of this work, and I'll just want to point out two things that came out. One was on the perception of tenure security, which is an important indicator around behaviors around conservation, investment in land, soil, and all of that. Before mapping, 75% of the community landowners were very worried or slightly worried about losing their property. After the process, after documentation, 74% of the respondents report that their worry has decreased. So we're seeing that impact in terms of community perception. And then finally, the quality of life, 83% of respondents at the beginning or at the end reported an improved quality of life due to CADASTA and this project. And of course, Pradhan was very much a part of that. And then the data collector piece on the right-hand corner is we had 2 separate evaluations, one with landowners and one with data collectors, and 95% of the data collectors reported not having access to a good alternative to CADASTA's platform, suggesting that we're filling a very large market gap. And indeed, we are starting now to see all of the partners that we're working with in India, where people are starting to claim and get these forest rights for the first time. And that is going to have significant impact on livelihoods and conservation. And again, going back to the circular economy then, that this geospatial technology has a very marked impact on the ability to secure land rights in the context in which we work globally, which is critical for regenerative natural resources, which is part and foundation of a sustainable circular economy, and leads to these things that we want it to, which is prosperity, environmental quality, and human well-being. So my final bit here is a bit of an appeal to the room, which is we have an incredibly ambitious vision for 2040, which some may say is audacious and a little bit crazy, but hey, we're putting it out there that we want to catalyze land systems change globally, leading to inclusive land and resource rights for half of these 1 billion tenure insecure people. So in order to do that, we need to come together with a lot of different partners and networks for funding, expertise, communications channels, influence, and partnerships. And so this is an appeal to all of you to try to join us in this endeavor globally to map 500 million people and secure their rights globally. So please join us and please get in touch with me to have that conversation. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Well, that was really excellent, wasn't it? There's nothing better than actually recording land rights and then being able to allocate that to the correct person, and then that may be mutually agreed. And then you can move forward with all the other things that we want to do based on that data set. So it's fantastic work by Amy and her colleagues. Our next presentation is... we have a question for Amy, if you wouldn't mind. Coming back to the stand. Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to ask.
So I loved it, it was great. How do you capture the data using drones or in some other way?
So we work with local context in whatever the data, we help establish that data model, and how data comes into the platform is very much dependent on our partner and what is needed in terms of outcomes, but also what is available. We've worked with drone imagery. We've brought in existing data from data that's been collected through other sources, and we have also run GNSS cables and linked it to the smartphones and the tablets to also improve accuracy. So it's done in a variety of ways, and it's always based on the local context and what our partners need. Are there any other questions now that I'm up here? Oh, okay, sure.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really enlightening and also encouraging for grassroots communities to build up together on this endeavor to find, a certain circularity in the economy. And my question is exactly about that. How do you find a circular economy in the fact that you start by registering something that will be otherwise very expensive to do because of the many investments from the government and probably the slack and stuff like that, and that this creates in a way a wealth for the people, and also, as you showed, inclusivity. How do you feel this is related to circularity? That is to say, it creates the value from out of nothing, or at least out of a register.
Well, when we're talking about, for example, sustainable food systems, or we're talking about any kind of production, whether it's energy, food, or materials, is we've got to start with the foundation of who these producers are, where these elements are coming from, and the relationship between people and their land is foundational to a circular economy when we're talking about accessing natural resources for that production. So to me, it's kind of to me, it's just kind of foundational, and I think we talk a lot at the macro level about this. We talk about individual behavior in our homes, about reducing waste and reusing things, but when it comes to the natural systems and the natural resources aspect of it, you know, again, there's a lot of talk about, you know, for example, the carbon credit market, using LiDAR, radar. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that, you know, to measure carbon stock in forests and things. Well, that's great, and I always raise the question, okay, if we're sort of monetizing these resources, and how are we ensuring that the legitimate landowners are taken into consideration when we're building out these kinds of local economies and ecosystem services and things like that. So I don't know if I answered your question, but to me, it's just kind of foundational, and it often gets left off the table. It's not a conversation that's happening enough, and I think it's starting out there, oh, indigenous communities' rights are critical to the achievement of, you know, our climate change goals, our climate action goals, but yet the formalization of those communities is extremely low. And so what are we doing about it? So to me, the idea of a circular economy isn't kind of a side issue. It's kind of really foundational to the idea, and very in line with indigenous thinking and traditional customs. That their whole mindset and culture is based on circular, the ideas of a circular, not just economy, but a circular, you know, existence, so to speak.
Just said it all.
Oh yeah, sure, of course.
So I would be interested to hear your opinion on when you have gone to do cadastra in certain places where it is then become clear that it is common ground or mutual ground or belongs to a tribe rather than one or two people or a family.
Yeah. So there's this big debate out there about individual versus community rights. And we, you know, CADASTA is an honest broker, if you will, in the sense that we don't ever try to adjudicate that. What we're doing is trying to support processes on the ground that are already underway, that are being led by local stakeholders. So in the case of this India project I mentioned, there's both an individual forest right piece and a community forest right. That's codified in the law. There are processes and systems. We're simply supporting that process. But in general, I think that it really depends on what the objective of the project is, who the stakeholders are, and what they're trying to get to. And we support all of that, right? We support all of that, and don't try to take a stance on whether it should be one or the other, because there are pros and cons to both of that. But I think the key is that communities not be disenfranchised, whether they're communities as a whole or whether they are individuals. I'll say one more thing. Even if there's legal demarcation or delimitation of community land that has actually been recognized by the government, what we're finding is inside that space, communities need tools. They need their own data. They need to manage and collect and use their own data for their own purposes inside the community land. So there's also an application of this even when the community land has been recognized. There's a lot of need for data around forest rights management, natural resources management, and other things that communities are doing inside their land. Okay. So, thank you, Karen.
That's an excellent answer. Very swift. Okay, so we next have Cathrine Armour, Chief Customer Officer from the UK Hydrographic Office. Fair data makes better data, FAIR. It's new and we all need to know it.
So when we talk about geospatial data, I think, as I said, one of the most important things is that it contextualizes, I don't want you to do that, darling. It contextualizes the data that is coming through different profiles of data and the information that we aggregate together with it. Thanks, we'll just go it that way. So it's really important when we're bringing all this data together that we have a common set of standards and they together can support the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So when we're making these decisions now, it's not about the geospatial data in and of itself, it's about how we contextualise all of the data that sits around that location, that place on the Earth. And when we're doing that in the marine environment, we're talking about multiple things. If you can think about a 10,000-ton vessel that's coming into a port, you're not just talking about what we call under-keel clearance, the bathymetry, the depth of the water that vessel is going through. You're talking about what berth can it go into, what is the size and the weight of that vessel, how can it be accessed, what other traffic is in that port environment, and you're needing to bring all of that data together such that the vessel pilot and the navigator, two very different people in different locations, can exchange and communicate how they're going to bring that 10,000-ton vessel into port. And that's a really complex system. But it has been in play in a non-digital way for hundreds of years. Now, for me, that makes it very exciting because it says to me that the marine environment is an environment where we're used to shared decision-making and we're used to shared data and we're used to being able to interoperate with each other. This is not new. What's new is the rate of the data, the dynamic nature of the data, and the fact that the data is now digital. And they're the things that we have to enable, and that's why I loved your presentation, Amy. But we don't do that particularly well, but we need to do that by FAIR principles. Okay? There's a new data standard that's coming out in the marine environment called S100, and I'm going to see if I can play you that video now. That's an extraordinary array of new standards that are coming out in the marine environment. But what it means is that we do need to partner with people more broadly than we ever have before. So the standard is being introduced by the International Hydrographic Office. There's a very basic standard at the moment for navigation called S57, which, as I said, has been in play for years. But this is a brand new standard that will enable us to bring those elements in that you've just seen, including weather, port boundaries, and those type of things. It's a very political, societal, and environmental set of standards. As far as you can imagine, with the open oceans, that's not such a problem. But as soon as you start moving into territorial waters, each of the political states needs to be able to agree just what standards will be used, and indeed whether that data will be more broadly exchanged. At the moment, under the agreements of safety of life at sea, they do. And our purpose also under the standard is not just to have it adopted from a technical perspective, but also to have it recognised by all of the countries that at the moment participate in the safety of life at sea, and that's the current standards of S57. So that's a really important piece of work. But you'll also see that we have an organisation in the UK called the UK Geospatial Commission. And they're working together with the agencies, all of the geospatial agencies in the UK, to be able to share data standards, make data interoperable, and ensure that it's reusable so that we can build that circular economy that Amy talked about, whereby we're not just enabling the economy, the macro economy itself, but we're actually enabling the economies of those that are using the data can find resource within the data, if I can put it that way, and be able to move forward in their communities. So what we're doing at the moment is we're making our trial data sets of the S100 series available on the Marine Data Portal. You'll see that. That's up there, we'll give that to you. And we're wanting to get feedback on those standards. But we're also making sure that they're available as APIs. And that's so that people can reuse that data. They are of the FAIR principle and integrate that into their solutions or their decision-making tools and be able to bring their tools to life. Those APIs will remain current. That's what we do. We update that data. Data is updated as we see change events occur, but certainly on a weekly basis for the most dynamic data sets as well. So I'd encourage you to participate in providing that feedback, but also exploring what value you can bring to the marine economy by using that marine geospatial data. Now, when you go to that, you'll see that you're at our Marine Data Portal. But what we've also done is we've provided, so for example, one of our latest projects has been working with RIEGL, and that's to make sure that we take their marine geospatial data and make it available in a marine data portal so that their decision makers locally are able to use that data for land planning, for port planning, ports development, tourism operation, and those kind of activities that support their local economy. We've also started a project with the World Bank to work with Kiribati to undertake the same kind of provision of data, but that's starting a lot further up chain. They haven't captured that data. We're using satellite-derived bathymetry, we're doing ground survey or sea survey using LiDAR to be able to map the seabed, the bathymetry, and provide them the same tool that RIEGL now enjoys through a marine data portal with an interface that allows them to query that data and make planning decisions and economic decisions as well. We also, for our overseas territories, we map all of their sea space as well, and we'll be working through how we make their data holdings more interoperable and provide greater access and potentially data sharing agreements across these users. And as I say here, we have over 130 bilateral agreements for supply of bathymetry, so seabed data. But again, as I said, we're looking to compile a varying amount of profiles of data as well. I think I've talked about that probably enough, but for example, I think this environment is becoming even more dynamic. So in the UK, we've just announced 11 Freeports, and for that for me really highlights the intersection of the marine environment and land, which most of you are working in. So a free port is where you have an exclusive economic zone around the port environment so that goods can be brought in, they can be processed, manufactured, value added, and then exported without a tax regime around that. Now, what that means for me is those integrated transport networks of the Freeport zone are going to be much more important. We talk about just-in-time shipping, but it's going to become just-in-time port management. It's going to become just-in-time rail and road transportation as well. And I know we've been doing a lot about digital twins, but that digital twin, that smart port, I think is going to be a critical enabler of economies that are built around ports and seafaring communities. That's me, that was quick. So happy to answer any questions. Maybe I can refer to my notes. Sorry, your name?
I was just wondering if you also address pollution and biodiversity loss and things like that, because it's quite relevant also for the local community maybe not so much for the industry, but that will be of big value.
Now, I'm not going to remember all of the 100+ standards, data within the S100 standards, but there is the environmental standard. And the work that we're doing with Kiribati is also particularly looking at mapping where their seagrass are. We've done a lot of work on mapping mangroves. Mangroves provide a huge rate of carbon sequestration, greater than the Amazon rainforests, as we know. So we've been doing a program of work to map that, and we've been doing the same with seagrasses using satellite imagery as well, because they secrete over 50, or they produce over 54% of the ocean's oxygen that they provide to the planet, of course. So there is a standard in there for an environment. We are not specialists on the environment, and for that we've just signed an MOU with JNCC, which is the UK government's expert agency on marine environmental data, but we're very interested in partnering with others worldwide. Yes, Amy.
Yes. Mike, I have a two-part question. One is, what are the one or two really urgent issues, pressing issues that you are addressing with this? I know you mentioned some of them, but what are like the top, like very urgent issues, and what would be your aspiration for this project in 5 years and 10 years? Like, what do you hope the outcomes of this would be?
Okay, really, really important questions. So the top issues are, one is, the first one that I mentioned, which is only 20% of the sea, of the oceans are mapped. And when you think of that covering 70% of the planet's surface, that's an incredibly unknown environment. And I think that's also critical for things like, as we see deep sea mining, as we see greater exploration, we want to make sure that we understand what's out there and what protection measures need to be put in place. And as I said, that's particularly true in the open ocean, where actually it's not owned. Okay, territorial waters have their own localized protection, but the open waters don't. And I think, therefore, mapping that, really, that's why I was so excited by the work you're doing, Amy, and the model that you've used to achieve that, I think is critical to then be able to bring in particularly the environmental protections that we need and make sure that there's governance around the open oceans. So that's probably the top one. The other one would therefore be the things that you experience in the terrestrial environment as well, which is agreements around data sharing, okay, and collaboration. I think, I would say they're probably close second and third, if I can put it that way. And then where we want to be in 5 and 10 years' time, well, we've just started. 2021 is the start of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And I think in 5 years' time, we know for ourselves as an organisation, we want to be moving into a live environment with these data trial standards, and we want to move towards adoption in industry. We want to see them adopted in areas where they can be, where there isn't existing regulation, first and foremost, and then adopted by the IHO as the standards for navigation. Now that's really important, because then we're able to better enable autonomous navigation and also subsurface autonomous navigation, which again helps with the mapping of the seabed. There's a commitment by the UK government called 30 by 30, or a global commitment. 30 by 30 is that we have 30% of the world's oceans are protected as marine park areas by 2030. So we're participating in that by working with Seabed 2030. So that's a big one for the 10 years out for us. And that adoption of all of the new technologies, and particularly low Earth observation satellites coming in, will be able to give us more communications with vessels at sea. So by 2030, we're hoping with the new standards, with the new technologies, with the communications through the satellites, that we'll be able to reduce the carbon in the maritime industry, because it contributes, I think it's 3% of the world's carbon comes from the maritime shipping industry. And we've got an ambition internally, much like your audacious goal. Our Chief Exec, Rear Admiral Peter Sparks, would like to see us be able to contribute to that through voyage optimisation by 2030 to bring that down. Our own UK government has committed to net zero by 2050. So that's the big goal for us. I have one question, and I think there's one down the back.
Hello, my name's Elspeth McIntyre. I'm from Atkins. So I work mostly in the UK. You mentioned Freeports, and we are currently discussing Freeports as a net zero and social value challenge. How would you recommend that people in the geospatial area use Freeports and look at that net zero challenge? What data would you see us using or analysis?
Fantastic question. So we've been working with the Port of Rotterdam. Our research, design and innovation team has been working with the Port of Rotterdam, building the database that will integrate between our database, which is our navigational data, Bathy data, the data I talked about, with the data that the Ports Association worldwide is moving into the digital environment. So I would suggest that get involved with the Ports Association. Port of London is one that's working towards that as well, more locally in the UK, and those groups will be coming out. We'll also be hosting seminars and engagements around creating digital twins within the port environment, working ourselves with those ports in the UK, but also, as I said, Port of Rotterdam and ports worldwide. Is that helpful? Great.
So I was just going to ask about whether you have seen lots of change over the past 30 years regarding SDGs, coastal erosion, flood rise, silt coming down off the land and into the waters, and how that affects what you're mapping and, you know, what the changes have been.
So it's really interesting because the coastal zone, which I suppose in the context of your question is the impact zone. So if we think of the coastal zone as the impact zone, traditionally, to answer the first question, 30 years ago, there wasn't a lot of interoperability as far as exchange of information and exchange of practice in that coastal zone. You sort of had the sea and you had the land, and the coastal zone wasn't recognised from a data perspective. But we've been working closely with the Ordnance Survey most recently to be able to map that intertidal zone in particular. They have, from up to our high water line, and we map beyond that. So we've been creating data sets to be able to do that. Then we move into change detection using satellite bathymetry, but also from the data sets we come in, we actually are using AI and machine learning to be able to automate the process that our cartographers used to undertake, which is that of looking at change detection. But I think to answer your question more specifically, there's still a lot that needs to be done as far as land systems change and how that impacts that tidal zone, coastal zone and maritime environment. At the moment, it's largely been done for security reasons and safety reasons, particularly with vessels and people crossing channels, for example, I might say. And it's also done where we need to get new vessels into ports, and the ports are required to undertake dredging operations. But I certainly think as far as an ecosystem of movement of, for example, as we've seen in the Canary Islands recently with the volcano eruptions, I really think that that's an area of work that needs to be undertaken that isn't closely managed at the moment. Thank you all very much.
Perfect, thank you, Cathrine. That was superb. Fascinating what lies underneath, you know? We never know really until we examine it. Okay, so we now have forest inventory by means of LiDAR data by Christian Sevcik, Manager and Strategic Software Alliances at RIEGL.
My name is Christian Sevcik. I work with RIEGL and I'm Manager for Strategic Software Alliances. And thanks for joining me on this talk on LiDAR and forestry. I think forestry is a big topic. We all know that, given the fact that almost a third of the landmass of this planet is covered by forests. Traditionally, forests have been a dual role as an economic resource and an ecosystem. And I think especially this economic resource has been traditionally of much importance, given the fact that timber was one of the most valuable resources in construction. So it's not a surprise that forests have been mapped throughout the centuries. I just randomly picked one of these old maps from 1683 in Germany now. It's a forest map trying to figure out what kind of timber is on the ground. If you put that in historic context, that was just after the 30-year war, so it was large devastated areas. So people try to evaluate what is there. And what we have today as map products in the forestry industry, on the right-hand side, it's one of these Austrian Federal Forest Administration maps. There's a bunch of different information, and of course these maps are generated from the various sources of remote sensing. Most and foremost, they use satellite imagery, of course, aerial imagery, and recently UAV imagery, but there's also LiDAR involved. And that's not surprising. LiDAR as a, I think, very valuable source for creating digital terrain models. And I think the question is, why is LiDAR used in that context? I want to give you just a quick intro to the LiDAR principle. And as we are a technology company, there is this inevitable slide with a formula. So I can't, yeah, so here it is. But that's the only formula I can provide you. So the idea is to send out the laser pulse, wait for the reflection, and measure the time between emission and reflection. And that you can calculate the range. It's very simple. So at its core, you can say a LiDAR instrument is basically nothing more than an extremely precise stopwatch. That's what it is. And so that's the standard situation. But the moment vegetation comes into play, there's a little more going on. So if you send out one laser pulse, there's multiple returns from a single echo, from a single pulse. So we have multiple echoes. And that, I think, is the reason why we can use LiDAR in forested areas, in vegetated areas, to penetrate the foliage, to get returns from the ground, get returns on the trees itself. And it does work, as you mentioned, in water bodies up to a certain extent. So I think that was the reason why LiDAR is, I think, a very information-rich source of data source. So traditionally, I don't know if you're in forestry somehow, the way a forest stand is evaluated, you have several plots, and they are surveyed by manual methods, and then from these dedicated plots, the entire, let's say, forest stand is extrapolated by means of yield charts. So there's a lot of guessing going on and a lot of models being involved that are due to year-long experience. And what we are trying to do is to replace that guessing by means of measurement. So there's various ways of collecting LiDAR in the forest, and depending on how you collect the LiDAR data, you get different results. Quite obvious. The most common way using LiDAR in forestry is by airborne collections. So you fly over on fixed-wing aircrafts, and you collect the data in a kind of a top view. That's perfectly suited for large areas. But there's also an alternative. You could run it from the ground that gives you more the perspective from bottom upwards. So you have a lot of information on the stem itself, on the ground itself. You probably miss a bit of the crown. And what fills the gap in between is now the UAV LiDAR that has become more and more popular in the recent years now. With its oblique view on the forest, it somehow covers all that area in between. So just to give an example how this looks like, this is a recent field test we have carried out a couple of weeks ago for the Sylvia Laser Conference in September. And it's the same area collected by aerial LiDAR, UAV LiDAR, and terrestrial LiDAR. And just from this top view, I think you can guess the differences. It's from the top view, it's a bit sparse, but you have an excellent view of the crown model. In the middle, the UAV LiDAR is much denser, and you have an excellent information on the crown itself. You have a good penetration down to the ground, and on the right, you see the data from the terrestrial LiDAR that is more captured from down upwards. So you have more information on the ground and less information in the top areas. If we slice through this data, it becomes more obvious. And this is a typical aerial collection. You see, you get all these points on the grounds, a bit of penetration and on the ground, and a bit of penetration in between, and a very detailed view of the terrain, really. The same slice, the same data set with the UAV LiDAR, much more information, much more data. You can even start guessing the stems of the trees, the individual trees. And if you do that from the ground, this information gets more and more prominent. But of course, as you see, the ground is a bit more sparse. I know ideally you could combine these data sets. That gives you the complete picture. It's probably not the economic way of doing it, but I think future developments will go in that direction. So it's a combination of various data sources we use for evaluating these field stands. So what are the typical products created from these data sets? With airborne data, what we see a lot is a very, I would call it simple. It's a vegetation mask as a map layer to say where is forest that fulfills a certain criteria. You need to cover a certain area. The stand has to exceed a certain height. So to know forest, not forest. The next step is what type of, or what quality of forest you have. Is this a low, a young forest? This is something with a big stand. So the canopy model provides us information about tree heights in that context. And from this tree height model, you can imagine as a bumpy surface. If you extract the local peaks, you can delineate this surface into individual trees up to a certain extent. I admit there's limitations to these to the method, but that's the basic idea to know how many trees are in this forest. And the one thing I find quite interesting is also the percentage of the covered area to the visible ground from top. So it's a relative, let's say, coverage. How dense is the forest? Is it more a sparse area? Is it open area or really densely? You can imagine a rainforest looks different than something in the north. So that's typical products we create out of these data sets. For the UAV LiDAR, it's more experimental, I have to admit. So this is an example we created with a software product from this company to the lower right. And what you see here is the point cloud colored by reflectance. So that's what the LiDAR sensor traditionally sees. So this is an unprocessed raw point cloud. We can separate this ground from non-ground, of course, in the point cloud, and then start to segment the single trees. This is by cutting at above roughly 1 meter above ground level and identifying individual stems. And from these seed cells, you can follow the trees upwards. So you create the model and can identify stems, branches, and all that information. And this, if you want, but that's way ahead, you can create a volumetric model of an individual tree. So you really get the volume of what the tree is. And that's one way of doing it. And another thing, if you have this point cloud and the model of your tree, stem and branches, and the rest of the point cloud gives you an idea how dense the foliage really is. So how many leaves are on this tree? So this, is one way of doing it. The terrestrial LiDAR, in contrast, you can do similar things. That is also combined with an aerial LiDAR to get the DTM, the terrain model. You can also do this segmentation of these individual trees. That's pretty straightforward here. And from this individual tree information, you can, let's say, calculate elevation, of course, tree heights. You can down project all this information to a covered area, so you have then metrics like crown diameter, that type of information. And what's the forester they're always interested in is this diameter at breast height, so that's 1.30 meters above ground, and what is the diameter of the tree. From that they can calculate the volume of timber. And that's information that can be easily extracted from these terrestrial LiDAR data. So, and I think that was it. So, thanks for your attention, and hope you enjoyed it. So, if there are any questions, I can answer them. If not, we have a booth there, so you can also join us at the booth and ask something. Yeah.
Are you currently working with any of the companies that are doing, using these technologies to do either forest global alerts of threats and or things like measuring carbon stock for monetizing, carbon credits?
Yeah, I mean, we are, maybe I haven't mentioned it, we are the manufacturer of the LiDAR sensors, so we are on the very other end of the application. I know there's a lot of research going on with universities throughout Europe, especially what this individual tree segmentation is something they're interested in, and it's kind of an ongoing research. The big scale, let's say, assessment of the forest trends, to my understanding, is more done in the Scandinavian countries. They are much more advanced in that. Canada is one of these candidates also. They do a lot, and there's some interesting research going on in New Zealand, actually. And they do exactly what you're asking for, trying to evaluate how much biomass is there, what is the carbon dioxide footprint of these, and how can they map that correctly. But it's research. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, over there. No, so the coffee is okay, I guess. Well then, thank you very much.